Hi, this is Paul. The following video is a recording that was made in an ad hoc session that was put together by Jacob Federecci, and I don't know if anybody else helped him, but I think it was mostly his brainchild. He wanted to gather together some of the people that worked in the medical field and wanted to talk about mental health issues and healing. Glenn, you'll see in this picture here, you've got Ken Loury, who works in the medical field. You've got Dr. Voortman. Now, Dr. Voortman is a member of the Cross Point Church. He's over 90. He was a psychiatrist. He worked quite a bit in the field. He's still very sharp and very active in the church, and he's a good friend of John Van Donk, and he's actually one of the reasons that the conference. He was one of the backers of the conference, actually, to put this conference together. And he's been a backer of a whole lot of things that surround mental health. Sevilla King is sitting next to him, and John Van Donk. And this was put together as I've released the conference on my channel. I've tried to keep it in order. This happened simultaneously with the conversation about the family that I just posted today. Today is Tuesday. And so I wasn't able to be in this room. Neither was Jonathan, neither was John, and neither was Catherine. But somebody, fortunately, because this was such an ad hoc event, we didn't have anything set up for the event, but someone wisely made a recording of it on their cell phone. So the quality of the sound is not that great. Now, when I listened to this myself, I listened to it on the airplane flying back from Chino back to Sacramento. And with headphones, it sounded fine. I could hear everything, and I thought the conversation was just absolutely tremendous. And so I very much wanted to include this in the record of the conference, even though Jonathan and John and myself weren't able to be involved in it. And even though the sound quality really isn't, say, up to the level of the rest of the sound quality of the conference, but I thought to leave it out would be to miss something. So that's what this video is. And again, we had no video footage of it, so I'm just using this still, and I'm just using the audio recording, and I hope you benefit from it because I thought it was a really lovely conversation.
Pine trees, grew up there. A lot of things happened to me, and eventually got through high school, college, and I met a girl, and she inspired me indirectly. I wanted to change my course from business to medicine. So it took a while before I became a doctor, but then she had married me in the meantime. Had a couple of kids, but I was a doctor after 1955. I think I was 30 then. And so I did the emergency room, and I did house calls, and I did military medicine a couple of years, came out here as a family doctor. And, I decided after I seen a lot of people that a lot of the illness after visit with the doctor's office were not cured by medicine and surgery. So I thought, what if I gave a crack at psychiatry? So I jumped into that, and I spent three years. By the time I got a year or two, I was already seeing a few people on the side that I was poor. And in a way, the rest is history. I continued to work and opened an office, started with one patient, no job. And it was 2, 5, 10, 20, or 100. And we started eventually a big clinic after a couple of years, psychologists, social workers, pastoral counselors, I had about 40 people working with me in the community. I always felt I was the community mental health center, private. I kept doing that for many, many, many years. And I finally retired when I was 82. And now I'm at 97. And I'm still seeing people, and there's still people that need care, and I'm one of the caregivers. I reach out to others. And I love to be with people who are coming alongside people. There's a lot of words for that. Counselor, paraclete, walking alongside, encourager, all those kind of words for the people like that do that. So what would you like to know? Give me a couple of questions.
Well, I have about 1,000, but it's not just us up here. So I'd like to, before I launch into those, I'd like to ask Sibylla to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about herself.
Hi, I'm Sibylla King. I'm a licensed mental social worker. I'm a private practice therapist in Washington, D.C. And it's a second career. I was in the art business until my 40s, and I went back to grad school. And I was interested in getting into therapy because, well, there was a couple reasons. One of them was I became, like Ken just said, he approaches this job as a philosophy. And I think that I started feeling that same kind of way about mental health, I guess you could say, is that there's something about being oriented in a world that can be more healthy than other ways. I don't know how else to put it, and I was kind of developing that in my mind, I guess you could say, exploring spirituality very seriously, and it seemed to be an antidote to, it seemed to contain with it an antidote in a way that could also be used therapeutically. And so I wanted to get the skills. I went back to school, and the other reason was I just started getting very interested in the fact that you can actually change your life for the better. And so I've been in practice for about 10 years. Like I said, second career. So anyone who is thinking of getting into it, you know, and wants to switch in their 30s or 40s, you know, it's totally feasible. And I live in Washington, D.C. I practice online a lot, but since COVID, but I'm kind of transitioning back into seeing people in person more. I divide my time between Washington, D.C. and the Eastern Shore of Maryland, which is a very rural area. Washington, D.C. is very liberal. Chestertown, Maryland is very conservative. So I kind of like being in the middle. Thank you.
So my name is John Van Donk. I am a certified mental patient. And my role in this session is to show people how to hold the mic to their mouth so that they can be heard. And beyond that, I can only tell you that once upon a time I was married to a licensed marriage and family therapist. She concluded that she should not be married to me. So this was her professional opinion. and she stuck with that. But we're friends now, so I can say this. And even if she were to find out that I said it, it would be all right.
How do I get one of those mental patient certificates?
I have monetized that.
All right, so I would like to pick up on what you just said, John. Thank you for saying that. That's something that's beautiful about what you've done at this conference already is tie together the threads that we're all interested in your own person. And I feel like you just did that because, and I would like to say why, and then ask you a question off of that. So here's the context that I'm seeing is each of us has a commitment to the field of medicine that requires particular certificates and governing bodies in the Western world. But we have moved into it, and the reason we're interested in it is something beyond what it tends to see for itself, I think. And in your story, Gary, you made this progression from a family doctor. You started in the emergency room, home calls, and then you became a family doctor, and then you had to specialize into psychiatry. And that feels to me like something I experience in medicine a lot, where we've fragmented so far apart that medicine is not about a person anymore, it's about fixing a particular thing. And that for me came together through Sibylla's story, and then in the life of John Van Donk, in the case that he was married to someone whose specialty was marriage. And in fact, somehow that didn't transfer into a marriage. And so I'm so interested to hear, Gary, your experience of what was it like to transition from treating a whole family and going to someone's home to having a clinic with all these tiers of different professionals to manage all these problems.
Well, I noticed right away when we were talking here together that we came to this helping from a different direction. I came through a scientific medicine direction, and others came from a social or spiritual direction into this helping people in time of struggle. So the majority of people who came to me came through their doctor. They had a sickness, a variety of sickness, and they were not getting better with their friends, their pastor, their doctor. And then they finally had to go to the psychiatrist. That was me. They didn't really want to be there, but they did. So I came to the scientific side. But I became much more aware as life went along that this is due to many, many factors that that is social science is a science. It's a body of knowledge. So in a way, we kind of come together because the person is suffering, and they don't have a person in their life that's helping them to do this at the time. So we have to be highly skilled in becoming that person that can help them through this crisis. And of course, loving them, caring for them, respecting and valuing them is, and I think, key ingredient in making them to be successful. And a sense of humor is another wonderful human trait to help those persons to laugh a little at life that's become so serious and so dangerous to themselves. So I see that we kind of overlap each other. We're not so totally different and coming from a different direction.
Need more mics. You get 2 more mics.
No, I'm just kidding.
There aren't mics.
We don't have more mics.
So from the scientific perspective that you came, what seemed to be the things that really differentiated what really helped people get better in those that got better from those that didn't?
Well, in my training with psychoanalysis and all of those lessons that I learned, I found that the patients weren't interested in that very much. And but within two years, or perhaps less, they had no interest in those kinds of things. They were talking about with ordinary language and with ordinary. So they were dealing with social things that had nothing to do with Father Sigmund or those folks. So I became really, in a sense, non-scientific as far as psychiatry was concerned. My training was. I first felt at times that maybe I was just a glorified bartender. There was actually a book that I read. It was called Rent-a-Friend, and the book didn't sell very well. The psychiatrist wrote that book, but it was good stuff. Become a really special friend. And I'm sure that each of you working with people, you find that you become a very, very special friend. And there's a lot of love in that friendship, a great deal of love in that friendship. Each person also wants to be loved. They want to be loved and valued and respected. They've been short on that in their lifetime, and as you become good at loving and caring and sharing, befriending, you'll find you're very successful. So I think that the power of loving in all of its variations is the key factor in getting better.
So I want to make sure I'm getting this from you, that what made the difference was the ability to love.
Yes.
And I'd like to ask both of you to answer this next question. Sure. I'll hand mine to you after I ask the question. And the question is, you heard this, you used this term I've never heard before, but I like it, the rent-a-friend. And in my own patients, that seems to be what most of them think a counselor is. And it strikes me that you didn't use it as the goal state of what it's like to see your counselor. So what do you do as a person engaged in the practice of being that person for someone to try to help someone who thinks you're going to be their rent-a-friend? How do you draw them out of that?
Since they're mostly referred to me by doctors, they expect me to be a scientist, which I am. So in my initial interview or two, I'm looking for all the physical disorders that might be account for this symptoms. And often I find that they have physical symptoms that these may need doctors and medicine and pills for. Of course, with wide variety, they do not need that. So I think that's my big job, so that I'm a broader education, and they expect that from me. And to find out, is this physical sickness in the usual sense of the term, or is this a psychological or spiritual problem? And they're hoping I'll tease that apart for them, and I do my very best to do that. Other people need to have lost their faith. This is a devastating thing to lose, because the people who help you lose your faith usually don't give you a new faith that's anywhere near as strong as the one you had. So you're then left faithless, and that's not a good state to be in. To try to find that new faith for yourself is very difficult. So the therapists are there to help the person reestablish faith, or in the faith that not the same faith that they had, or maybe parts of it. So I think I see that as a key part of reestablishing their faith as a special friend. Make sure that find that they don't have a disease that need pills and surgery for, and to become a loving friend to them, which are very hard to come by. And to become one of those is it's a very exciting day to go to love all these people. I had this pastor friend, and I said, "Well, I'm a sort of a professional lover." And he was very quick. He said, "So am I." And of course, I always, whenever possible, weave humor. I'm not very humorous myself, but I ask them to bring me jokes, because nobody tells psychiatrists or jokes. So I encourage them, bring a joke in about, and of course they always bring a psychiatrist joke, I have to be put down, so that laugh together is a very healing force, Yeah. So I can laugh at their troubles, and but they also.
So basically your question is, how do you open up people to the idea that they can get better?
Maybe something.
Yeah, sure. But I think a lot of people, well, where I work is a little bit different because I'm in a big city, so therapy is, a lot of people have an idea of what it is already, and a lot of the people I see have already had therapy. But I think that there's some things that, well, first of all, one of the reasons I was very interested, one thing that brought me to this corner was Jordan Peterson, like I did a lot of you. But two reasons I wanted to study his lectures is he was very interested in Carl Rogers and he was very interested in Viktor Frankl. And Carl Rogers has a term called unconditional positive regard. meaning that no matter who the person is in front of you, just what I said, unconditional positive regard. I mean, I don't even really need to go into what it is. Viktor Frankl is the, is the person that we most, maybe Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke today, but before these guys, we associated meaning in life with Viktor Frankl. And these are two things, I think, that these are two ways in with people is, as Dr. Gary said, loving them in that way, in the full, in the full human being that they are, and being that, loving them is the unconditional positive regard, and that's something that can be very novel to someone, not to feel like they're being pushed back against or criticized or looked at in some kind of way. The other way is introducing people to the notion that they can orchestrate their own personal philosophy. And this philosophy, their worldview, what they really feel and think, what they really believe, and maybe even more transcendent elements, is going to give them some kind of meaning and worldview in their life that they haven't had before. That they've been, given certain ways to think and feel and been educated in certain ways, and that they can actually break out of that. That they actually have the agency and capacity to reorient themselves and have a worldview based on who they really are. And remember, with the unconditional positive regard, you're getting to the real person, and from that real person, you can develop your world philosophy, your personal philosophy, your personal worldview based on who you actually are, not what you've been taught to think and believe. And that goes into the third element, which means a lot of times people, there's a trope, of course, that your parents cause all your problems, but there's a way of breaking that down to where you don't have to blame your parents or your relationship with them as the actual human beings they are today, for example. It's just the attunement between their parents and themselves is no matter how great your parents are, there's going to be areas of suboptimal times. I mean, some worse than others, but even if you have great secure attachment, there's still tweaks and adjustments from childhood that you bear with you throughout your life, and those have to sort of be, kind of finessed, understood and finessed out, and reconfigured in a way that works. They're parts of, and one thing I use a lot is parts of self, and people don't realize, and one thing that's really, really liberating to people is to understand that within us are different personalities that are often in conflict with each other. And if you over-identify with one personality, the bad part of you, and you think this is your totality, then no wonder you're in distress. And to understand that there are different parts, which is the way I see it, so this is my opinion, it's not, but I think most theories have some element of this. Then, you have kind of you have a congregation within you that you're trying to get along, and that means that you are all these parts, and that makes you, and altogether you're your whole self. And I think that's about it. I mean, there's other things, but those are the main things.
So Gary said something about loving people, and he will not likely tell you this himself, but I have the good fortune of having lunch with Gary once a week, and that's why I'm as emotionally well-adjusted and balanced as I am. But what actually happens often during that time is that Gary is able to engage waitresses, and they somehow feel compelled to tell their woes about their relationship with their fiancés or their boyfriends, and why their job search is not going right, and what educational aspirations they might have. And here he sits across the table from me and just loving on them, and I am very pleased to be able to observe that. So that's a compliment, Gary, for you. Yeah.
So first of all, on Thursday we went and played paintball, and then we all went to the pizza. I ran into Karen Wong, and I was happy to see her, and she told me one of the main reasons she was here was that she was excited to see you and talk to you, Phil. And I have not encountered your work up to this point, but I am quite suddenly understanding why that might be the case for her. Because as far as I can tell, what you've just put forward is something like an instantiation or a way to do therapy in the modern Western context that actually integrates what John is doing. I mean, you just explicated agape. That's what you, like, and I'm sorry, like, if you don't know what it's like to practice medicine, you don't know what it's like to, I will often at my work say to other physicians, PAs, practitioners, that I think of working in modern Western medicine as no man's land of World War I. The trauma happening to people's souls it's devastating. It's bad enough, it's awful for patients, and it's worse for doctors. And they don't know a way out, but they're there, right? The gas shells are falling behind them and the barbed wire's in front of them, and they are there. And so that's what I'm feeling right now, so thank you. Something that has been important to me is the notion that the philosopher is the doctor of the soul. And I take that very seriously. And I think that maybe to the degree that we've lost the connection between being a doctor of the soul and a doctor of the body is a part of why we are where we are. And Gary, you talked about the necessity of distinguishing whether it's a physical illness or an illness of the soul, if you're okay with that term there. And that you have to rule out the possibility of a sickness with the body before you move on to the soul in the current model. And this is something I'm very interested in, and I've read a lot about this question of how the interpenetration of mental health problems and physical illness, how that's a continuum and there's not a sharp distinction, most likely, possibly. And so I'd love to hear you talk more about that, where you see where you would distinguish between a physical illness and an illness of the soul, and maybe how to suggest what wisdom you have of addressing them simultaneously if that's.
Well, the person coming in hopes that their specialist, is thinking of every possibility of why they're in trouble, they're sick, and considering all those factors. And since I've been trained as a physician, I love to be a physician. I always keep all those possible symptoms in mind. What else could this be, but besides what I think it is? You mind, you have questions about that, or you could call your doctor back and say, well, have you really checked this? Their case came to me a long time ago when a young man, he was sick, he was vomiting, his girlfriend had dropped him, and his mother brought him in. She said we were going to take him to our hospital back then in Denver. So I was a new doctor in town. And so I brought him in to see me, and so I'm talking to him, and he's telling me about his girlfriend. And I knew her. They're people, but I thought, these kind of people are too tough to take a dropped girl and get this sick. And then the mother said, well, he's been vomiting, so it just flies out of him. The word came, explosive vomiting, bingo. Brain tumor, brain pressure. So instead of getting out my instrument and looking in his eyes to see if he had pressure, I called my next door neighbor, the doctor, and said, look, I think this guy's got pressure in his brain. So walked him over there, and sure enough, he did have that in his brain. And got a neurosurgeon. He's alive today, this very day. He's alive. He would have been dead if he ever got an airplane, he would have been dead. So this is what they expect of the doctors. If the therapists, they don't expect that of them. But I had that kind of knowledge. So I've turned up many illnesses that are masqueraded as social problems. But primarily they are social problems. That's what I do primarily every day. So knowing what the symptoms could be is a key factor. If you don't know, find out.
I could only comment with limitations because of the the physical illness aspect. I'm always in relationship with a psychiatrist for that part of it. If it's a malady of the soul, that's just the beginning of hopefully a fruitful inquiry. And one thing I should mention is I think people are frightened. And again, I work primarily in Washington, D.C., a very secular society, let's just say. I think people are frightened of the idea of transcendence. A lot of what we're doing here in this little corner is trying to figure out how to overcome materialistic thinking. Robert Pirsig would call it subject-object thinking. And I think the notion that that's a possibility hasn't even occurred to people. And that in itself, that paradigm shift is spectacular, I think, to mending the maladies of the soul.
So some people are afraid of the transcendent. But I also know that some people are afraid of therapists because of that. Because you were gracious enough, and I appreciate that, and I know where Gary generally is coming from, all great admirers of Carl Rogers and unconditional positive regard. But when I was in seminary, I had to write a paper contrasting Carl Rogers with, anybody know? Anybody know who is the obvious counterpart of Carl Rogers?
Sigmund Freud.
Maybe, but no.
Your mom?
How about if I say, how many of you know this name, Jay Adams? Oh, now we're talking. Yeah. Jay Adams, of course, knew the will of God, or he at least was able to point people to the will of God and told them that if they would correct their lives according to these principles, their problems would be over. And he actually practiced that way. There still are a few people left in Southern California who do this kind of thing. I know some of them, and that scares me. So that would be the kind of transcendence that I would be afraid of in the mental health profession.
But you're not guilty.
No, I hope not.
Can we ask questions?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So, one thing that you said earlier about observing Gary when you're together. Sorry, I'll try to speak louder so I can hear. Here we go. Thanks, John. Yeah, so one of the things that struck me as I was listening to you describe your observations of Gary is one of the paradigms that I feel like that we have that might be good to think about reconfiguring is the separation, right, of the particularity of each of your professions and how you study and practice versus taking a holistic approach of addressing the whole person. And I think people have made the point that psychiatrists almost serve the purpose of a good friend in a way that, like, did we always need to have that as a profession? I'm just wondering the kind of skill that you have based on, I want to ask if it's based on your training. Is it based on something that you gained in your academic studies from your practicing? Because I'm thinking, if we could put you out of work, would that not be would that not be a good thing? If we could all learn how to do the same thing and serve the function of a psychiatrist just within our own circles, which is kind of like what I see Estuary as kind of doing, something like that. And I see Estuary also as a training program in this way. So I'm wondering if you could comment, because there's also the fact that the academic training does not necessarily make for a good psychiatrist or a good social worker. I would imagine you'd probably agree with that too. So what is the element of the training or of how can we arrive at putting you out of work, if that's not too bad of a question to ask?
Eliminate malpractice insurance.
Well, that's a wonderful question. There was always professional competition going on, always. That's what human beings do. I always thought we were the best people, and that the psychologists thought they were smarter than we were, and some of all that was true, and some of it was baloney. So I decided that I was going to respect everybody who had a different degree than mine. They had to demonstrate that they were as good as they could be in their profession, and they always had my respect. And we were different, but they were highly competent. So I didn't have any real competition with them. If I wasn't good enough to collect referrals from other people, they said, go back to see Dr. Voortman, he's a good doctor. And they said, well, I found someone who was a lot cheaper and better than you are, so be it. But I always had work. So I think a little healthy competition is good. And neither one has got a corner on all the wonderful needs that people have. We have a lot of suffering people. A lot of people who've come here are suffering. I'm sure many of the folks got parts of them that are suffering. And I kind of would like to use the word suffering rather than sickness. Because the sickness is kind of medical. But suffering, if all of us know suffering, it is really bad to suffer. And some help us reduce that suffering or overcome it completely. Anybody can do that, I respect.
Well, I don't mean anything by this, but what I mean, which is, I don't think this is a very good time for therapists to go into business. And I think that, just thinking here, how am I going to answer this question? I think that as long as we have a culture that overvalues the wrong things and undervalues the right things, we're going to have a very difficult time helping each other recover, because if your whole cohort is caught up in the way the culture is now, who is going to come in and where are you going to get a different opinion from? So maybe, I would say people should, a lot of people would say go back to church or have a spiritual practice, but even spirituality can be quite corrupt. And I think you all know what I mean. And, again, in a big city, you have a lot of, I think mindfulness practice is a great thing, don't get me wrong, but there's a lot of commodification of Eastern practices. Yeah. And so that's going to be a hard place to go. It's kind of feel good. It doesn't give you, how to deal with So it's not a great time. I mean, and to get rid of outside objective assistance. And if it's not, if people aren't ready to go back to a true spiritual practice, then I don't know where else there is. So that's the only way I could really answer it right now.
I'd like to answer, or provide part of the answer, if that's okay.
Oh, there's a question.
I'd like to provide,
sure.
I just
Yeah.
want to,
Yeah.
because there's something here that I would like to talk about really quickly, because part of, if I understood you correctly, Corey, part of your question, which was a great question, was what is it that differentiates the practitioners who are really caring for the person, the whole person? At least that's part of what I understood from you.
Yeah, and what can we gain from that?
Yeah.
Like we as non-practitioners.
Right. And so I think something that Gary pointed to, I'd like to riff on, if that's okay. You know how I used that metaphor analogy of World War I earlier? People who are under a lot of threat tend to either crumble or become somewhat narcissistic. And a lot of what I experience in medicine is, I'm not going to call it full-blown narcissism, but there's a lot of ego. There's a lot of ego, there's a lot of infighting, there's a lot of competition.
Especially the cardiologist.
Especially the cardiologist. It's yeah, that's not a joke.
I did.
I mean, I'll give you an example. I'm part of a private practice that practices in a relatively medium-sized town. There's one hospital that serves a large population, and the cath lab, which is where we do our main procedures, is the money-making center for the hospital. Like, hospitals don't make money on people who are laying in the hospital bed. They make money on outpatient procedures, and especially cardiology's outpatient procedures. This lab supported the hospital in a large part, $15+ million a year. There were two cardiology groups in town, mine and another private practice, and for unbelievably trivial reasons and egotism, on both sides, the two private practices started their own. They built a $10 million building and started their own outpatient cath lab, and so they have completely undermined the hospital's primary income source. And it's a thing that's happening, and the people who are really suffering from it is the community and the doctors themselves who are in it. So that's just an example. Sorry, it's a little bit long-winded, but it's an example of the kind of thing that starts happening when a group of people feels under threat and they start pointing fingers at each other and start devouring each other. And there's a flip that Gary pointed to. When you recognize the value in the other person and that you are in a synergistic relationship with them. And I think that gets down to the fundamental thing that we're all really here looking for, is this flip to where the relationship, okay, so now I'm going to switch to John Van Donk language a little bit. The relationship of me to another person, their technical capabilities, their knowledge, their personality, their ego is deeply valuable, but it is incidental in the sense that there's a person underneath them with whom I am in love. That's one of the deepest ways I can say it. And when that happens, this is what John is on with the dialogos. This is where that's going. Is that when you get that I-thou relationship, then all the stuff that's stacked on top of it, all the academics, all the training, all the ideas and philosophies and all this stuff, right? It's not very important if we don't have that happening, right? Because if we don't have this happening, and in fact, if we're fighting against each other in some sense, right? If you're familiar with Jordan Hall, you might be familiar with the distinction of game A and game B. That's part of what I'm pointing to here, is if you don't have that kind of orientation toward each other, you're not going to be generating healing. And so that's what we need.
That is a great final word there, because I was told by the ladies in the kitchen that if we would not get out of here by 5:15, that they would forcefully kick us out. So it is 5:15. I don't know how we want to wrap this up. I mean, if we want to move the whole thing, wait, okay, Jacob has a solution.
Anybody who works in mental health probably has noticed there's all kinds of problems within mental health. If the people who are here today are interested in helping actually move mental health forward, Catherine and Eamon Wilson, both of them work in mental health, and we're hoping to somehow get people together who want to work in mental health towards a less politicized and more scientific and more spiritual, and we're recruiting, yes, integrated, and we're recruiting. So consider reaching out to Catherine and Eamon. Eamon is a psychologist. Catherine is a
Family therapist.
yes. And hopefully we'll get many more people involved.